Well, hello, everybody. So welcome back to the final two topics of Unit 2, which had to do with adaptations, whoops, and ecological succession. And we'll talk about what each of those terms mean here shortly. But keeping in mind our primary focus over all of Unit 2 is the fact that ecosystems have structure and function that change over time. So the reading to accompany this set of notes from the Miller textbook is section 4.4, pages 102 through 110, and then also section 7.2, which is pages 186 through 188. Okay, so we're going to quickly define evolutionary adaptations and then talk about their role in determining species adaptability and ability to cope with changes. So evolutionary adaptations, right? We're talking about genetic traits that help an organism to survive and to reproduce in its environment. Now, some really key parts of that definition. First of all, we're talking about genetic traits. And the fact that they are a genetic trait has to do with the fact that it can be inherited from parents and passed on or to children. Okay, so we're not talking about acquired traits. So, for example, let's say Mr. Huderberg decides to hit the weight room really hard, right? So I have just kind of my natural body type and physique. Now, any muscle mass that I put on, um, over time, right? That's acquired muscle mass. It's not inherently part of my DNA to be that bulky or not. Okay, so that's an acquired trait. So my children, therefore, if I were to have children after bulking up, would not end up being born more muscular than before. That's because that's not a genetic trait. It's an acquired trait. So adaptations that we're referring to in this context are genetic traits, right, that help an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. So for example, the white fur of an Arctic fox, or the height, particularly the long neck of giraffes, or beak shape in certain birds that help them to get food. All right. So adaptations to a changing environment are limited to the genetic traits that are already a part of the population. Um, and so we've talked about genetic diversity already in a previous topic. Okay, so genetic diversity is referring to the different adaptations or the different characteristics that are part of the gene pool of a group of the same species. All right, so when we have a change, for example, in the environment, right, the adaptations available that might help to cope with that change have to already be a part of that population. Okay, meaning that the species don't just add characteristics that are not already a part of their DNA. So in the case of giraffes, for example, right, the evolutionary pathway of modern giraffes was not that giraffes were stretching their necks and therefore acquiring longer necks over time because they were reaching for higher food. What we had was variation in ancestral giraffes. Okay, some likely had longer necks than others. Those with the longer necks better able to access food, therefore more likely to survive, therefore more likely to reproduce, and therefore over time, a population of giraffes developed where the common trait or more common trait was the longer neck, and those with shorter necks, essentially that gene or that variation in genes essentially died out, was not as able to survive as that gene type, phenotype, right, of longer necks. Okay. Likewise, probably similar pathway with polar bears. Polar bears and brown bears share pretty common recent common ancestry, right? But variation in color of hair, for example, is a pretty common variation in mammal species. But that specific white-colored fur in polar bears was probably heavily selected for in their environment, right? But ancestors to polar bears likely had a variety of hair colors. Okay, so I have to understand that the gene had to be a part of that population already. Okay. Now, sometimes new traits do appear in a population because of mutations. So, one of the things you guys have to understand is that, you know, the DNA that makes up our genetic code, right, when that gets copied from one cell to another and then eventually passed down from parents to children, right, the copying, transcription, and translation, and all those things that happen uh, under cell division is not a perfect process. Now, the cell does have like mechanisms inside of it to help to repair imperfect copying of that DNA, but occasionally there's a mistake in translation, for lack of better phrasing, right? And that little blip in the DNA is what we call a mutation. Now, often those mutations are benign, don't cause anything. They're more often harmful than beneficial, but it is on occasion that a mutation might bring about a new trait that is favorable and does help that species to survive. Okay, um, but the lesson to be learned here is that a change in the genetic makeup of a species over time, right? Whether that involves the introduction of a new gene through or a new trait through mutation, or just the overall change of a species to increase the frequency of a certain gene. It takes time. It takes generation upon generation. All right. So a species being able to change their genetic makeup due to a change in environment, it takes time. And so if we have an abrupt change or too big of a change, it can put real stress on that species to either adapt or to migrate, or in some cases go extinct. All right. Now, moving us forward and transitioning over to what we call ecological succession. So first of all, we have to understand that if you go to a forest, right, an old growth forest even, right, we're talking about a community of living organisms that has co-evolved, right? Um, but they take a long time to establish themselves. There's even like this idea of what they call climax community that we won't really discuss here. But as you know, a forest ecosystem doesn't just emerge, right? So after a clear cut, if we just go plant some trees, right? Uh, even 10, 15, 20 years later, we don't really have a fully functioning forest ecosystem yet. There's sort of these series of things that have to happen to reestablish that forest community. And that series of things is what we call succession. All right. So succession is the process where a community develops slowly through a series of species. So earlier species, or what we call pioneer species, they come in and alter the environment in some way. And through those alterations to the environment, they end up making it more suitable for the next in the series of species, who will then alter the environment in some way to make it more habitable for the next in that series, and so on up. So what you see in the diagram here is what we would call primary succession, which we'll get to in just a second, right? But there's two main types of succession that we want to discuss. There's what's called primary succession and secondary, and we will talk about what each of those entail here in turn. So primary succession, right? And this is something I definitely want you to get locked in place in your brain, right? Is primary succession begins with a previously uninhabited environment. All right. So where we might see a previously uninhabited environment is from bare rock. So maybe there was just a lava flow, and that lava flow has cooled off and hardened into just bare rock. All right. Um, it could be um, a glacier that has just started retreating up a valley, right? Leaving behind it essentially the bare rock that it has scraped clean. Okay. Um, so that's where primary succession would begin. Essentially, bare rock, and really the defining characteristic is there's no soil present. Soil formation takes a while, by the way. Okay, so the process of primary succession can take hundreds to thousands of years, but because before we can develop a forest community, if the climate and et cetera, like allows for it, right? There's a series of things that have to happen to build up that topsoil to kind of pave the way for trees to even become established in the first place. And that can take hundreds to thousands of years. So a general succession pattern, right, begins with, like I said, no soil, right? We have our pioneer species that come in and essentially begin the process. We'll talk about lichens specifically here in just a second, right? And they pave the way for smaller, hardier plants, all right? Over time, because we have breakdown and erosion of rocks for minerals, and then we also have a buildup of organic material as the lichens and moss die to make some organic content and with those mineral particles. Then we get grasses and flowers and so on. Then we might end up with some perennial bushes and so on, and then up to some trees that tolerate less topsoil, eventually up to a full forest. Again, if the climate and other factors allow for such a thing, right? That is what we call primary succession. But it begins with those pioneer species that alter that environment, in this case, allow for the beginnings of soil formation in the first place. All right. Secondary succession. Now, first of all, I want to get this as clear as I can. Secondary succession does not happen after primary succession. Okay. In both cases, we're starting with essentially a clean slate. But the major difference here is secondary succession begins where soil is already in place. So here's an example where that might happen. Let's say a really intense wildfire moves through and basically wipes out all life in an area. Right? It's going to wipe out the trees, the plants, and push all the living organisms out. Right. So what we'd have there still, though, is soil. Right. So we don't. The beginnings of primary succession, remember, begins where there's no soil present. Secondary succession comes after like a pretty catastrophic event that came through and wiped out living things. Now, secondary succession can also happen on an abandoned agricultural field where basically farmers have removed all vegetation, right? It can happen in abandoned building sites where maybe they started to develop an area and abandoned it for whatever reason, right? But secondary succession is a much quicker process usually than primary succession, and it begins with soil. So rather than starting with like lichens and mosses, for example, we start with and like annual weeds and crab grasses, building up to like local weeds and flowers, and then to that maybe forest community again. But it wouldn't take nearly so long because you don't have to go through that process of building up soil in the first place. Okay? So some defining terms here that we really need to make sure we have in place before I see you guys again. Pioneer species is referring to the first members of an uninhabited area, right? They have specific adaptations that allow them to survive with few other species and with little to no soil, right? So they must be producers or at least accompanied by producers because that's the only way to get energy into the system, right? So most common are lichens and mosses. Lichens, by the way, are actually they're similar to corals in that they're actually two organisms. They are a fungus with an algae symbiont. So the algae symbiont basically provides food, right? Um, and the fungus portion, like basically attached to the rock and slowly breaks down the rock to form mineral particles. Okay. Another important term here is what we call keystone species. So once an ecosystem has gone through its succession pattern and we've got this established community, in a lot of ecosystems, not all, but a lot of them, we have certain species who have a really important role in basically maintaining that ecosystem. And those are what we call ecosystems, uh, sorry, keystone species. So an example might be elephants. So in the grasslands in Africa, semi-arid, where elephants are common, um, really the main thing keeping the grassland a grassland is in fact elephants because there is often enough moisture for trees to take root and plant themselves to create a forest ecosystem. Now, much of the life in Africa is well adapted to the grassland ecosystem. And forests, if allowed to, could start to take over and completely change that habitat and make it less suitable for many of the species that live in the grasslands or savannas of Africa. All right. The presence of elephants, part of what elephants do is they actually knock over a lot of the young trees and push them over. Um, and they also help to to basically graze on the grasses and help the decomposition and maintain soil quality, right? So if we were to remove elephants from the grassland ecosystem, over time we would see that ecosystem completely change. And not just the elephants would suffer, but many of the other species adapted to the savanna grasslands would also have to adapt or migrate or go extinct. Okay, often our keystone species are predators. If there's time in class, I'll show you guys a cool video on the impact of wolves on the Yellowstone ecosystem, right? Um, and sometimes we have what are called ecosystem architects, which elephants might fit into as well. But beavers, for example, alter certain ecosystems pretty profoundly through basically engineering their ecosystem to better fit their needs. So by building dams in these homes, they change the flow of water and set up not habitat not just for themselves, but for countless other organisms that are well adapted to function in the presence of beavers in the dams that they build. All right. Um, Now, last but not least, and this is a topic that we've already discussed, but we'll bring it up again, are what we call indicator species. And they are a species whose presence or absence indicate the quality of the environment. So when we did our Simpson's Diversity Index and Pollution Tolerance Index earlier, we were essentially looking at certain indicator species. Okay. I think that takes us to the end of this set of notes.